Hello and thank you for watching the Angry Rooster Creations channel. Today we are doing another fountain pen related video. This is going to be a test of Noodler's Liberty's Elysium ink. Now this ink, as you can see, all I have of this is a sample vial of ink, so I won't be able to show you the actual bottle. But this is a Goulet Pens exclusive ink. I believe, from what I understand, this pen was specifically formulated to the sort of personal color and specification, I guess, of Brian Goulet. So it is, this was essentially their sort of like own particular custom color here. I think there's some other exclusive ink colors that they carry and other pen companies carry that aren't necessarily mixed specifically for the companies, but my understanding is that this one was mixed specifically for the for Brian Goulet, according to sort of a work that he and Nathan Tardif did together to come up with this color. So in this video, I'm going to test this ink on 5 different papers. I'm going to test it on 20-pound copy paper. I'm going to test it in a Pen Gear composition notebook from Walmart. I'm going to test it on a Blick 50-pound white sulfite drawing paper, a Koh-i-Noor 50-pound sketch paper, and a Canson 98-pound mixed media paper. Now, I know that those papers aren't necessarily what most people use for fountain pens, but I generally use my pens for drawing and artwork, and so those are the papers that I have on. Those are the kinds of papers that I typically use, and these are some of the papers I have on hand to do this test with. I'm also going to show when I'm done with the writing samples, I'm going to show a chromatography that I did, and I'm going to do a quick water resistance test. So without further ado, we'll get on with the writing tests. And here is our 20-pound copy paper. Now I'd like to mention that the pen that I'm using for this test is a Majon/Moonman B25 with a fine nib. Alright, so looking at the lines here, it appears, at least on the face of this, to have worked fairly well with the copy paper here. I don't see any real excessive feathering. I mean, there's a couple spots where I can maybe see some feathering. It's not terrible. I mean, you have to be really close to see it. I don't even know if it's going to show up on the camera here. When I did the 10-second smear test, I was not, maybe that last line, there's a little bit of a smear. I don't know if it's going to show up at the very top. And I got a little bit of a smear at the scrub. Now, it looks like, usually on most of the inks that I've tested so far, I don't usually see any kind of hints of shading on the copy paper due to it being a pretty, absorbent and fast, just sucking up the ink. But with this one, I do see some shading. Not a lot. But it leads me to believe that when I get to the later papers that are less absorbent, we're probably going to see some pretty decent shading with this ink. And like I said, with the smear tests here, this being copy paper being pretty absorbent, it usually, inks tend to sort of set into the paper pretty quick. So even just because it didn't smear on this paper does not necessarily mean it's a fast drying ink, but at least on copy paper it's pretty fast. Now, if we flip over here to the back, we do have some bleeding. I don't think the bleeding that I've seen a couple of spots where I kind of paused on the paper while I was writing, I don't think it's bad enough that if there was another paper underneath this one that it would have bled through. Maybe that spot, and there might be some on the smear here. There's a pretty decent amount. Well, I mean, it's not the worst, but there is some ghosting here too. I would say if you were using this ink on copy paper, you might want to be, maybe only in a situation where you don't plan on using both sides of the paper, because I think you would have enough of this show through that it would kind of muddy up what you were writing if you were using this ink on both sides. But if you have a piece of copy paper and you only need to write on one side of the paper, you should be just fine, because the ink looks fine on the front, but it's got some bleed, a little bit of ghosting, enough that I probably wouldn't want to use this in an application where I needed to write on both sides of my paper. So that's it for the copy paper. We're now going to move on to the composition notebook. And now here is the Pen Gear composition notebook. Alright, that's got us taken care of in the composition notebook here. Now, looking at it, don't really see a whole lot of bad spreading. I don't see, maybe just a hair, a couple places here and there towards the end of some of the strokes where more ink got dumped on the paper. There's a little bit of feathering. It's not terrible. It does not muddy up the letters. It doesn't muddy up the lines. It doesn't make it hard to read. This is a college-ruled notebook here, so that's for those in metric countries that maybe aren't familiar with the college, regular, or wide ruling. College ruling is a 7mm ruling spacing. So it's on the smaller side, at least for our books here in the United States. And at least on the front of the page, it looks perfectly fine. I don't see that for the front side of this page that there's any problem with using the ink. I do see some shading. I don't know if that's going to come through on camera. But there is some shading, like I said, towards the end of the letters, where the end of the pen strokes are, where more ink was on the paper. There's clearly shading here. Now on my 10-second smear, it looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So at least 6 seconds. You're still a little wet after 6 seconds. You can see that I did get some smearing there too on the scrub. So a little wetter, or longer drying than a few of the inks that I've tested, but not terrible. I think it's just still a pretty it looks like it's a relatively quick drying ink. Now we're going to flip the page here, and honestly not bad on the back of this page. I got a couple spots here on the EF on the print line. There's some ghosting, not really bleeding. I don't really see anything that I would really consider a bleed through the page. Like I said, some ghosting here, but that's not terrible. If you were writing in this notebook with this pen, I would say you could certainly use both sides of the paper. So writing in a notebook like this, or at least with this particular brand notebook, is not a problem to use both sides. This pen would be perfectly usable in this application. Alright, so that's it for the composition notebook. Our next paper is going to be the Blick 50-pound white sulfite drawing paper. And now here is the Blick 50-pound white sulfite drawing paper. Alright, so that's got us taken care of on the white sulfite drawing paper. Now I will state that of the art papers that I'm going to be testing, this one is the most absorbent. But I don't really see much. I don't really see any spreading. I actually do not see any feathering at all. The feathering so far has been minimal on the other two papers, but none here. Definitely picking up more shading. I don't know if that's going to show in the on camera, but it should show when I do the photo scans of the pages. But there's definitely shading here. This is a shading ink. You can see on the 10-second smear, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe a hint at that fourth line. So it looks like 6.5, 7 seconds to dry on this paper. Still pretty quick. You can see the scrub smear, not a whole lot. So this is, like I said, I believe this is still a fairly faster drying ink. Let's see what we got on the back. Once again, this is a 50-pound paper. I may have one slight ghosting spot there you might be able to make out. Maybe a little here, not much. This is a 50-pound paper, so you shouldn't expect to see much. If you end up seeing, I've had some other inks that have ghosted some through this paper, but based on what I've already seen with this ink on the other two papers, I wouldn't have expected a whole lot back here, and there isn't much. So, obviously with a drawing paper like this, you usually don't use both sides. You do a piece of art on one side, and then the other side you don't do anything to, especially if it's a piece that's going to be displayed. So it wouldn't really matter too much on a paper like this, but there are other papers that are, roughly 50 pound that you might be using for other uses besides art, and you might, in that situation, need to use both sides. Once again, paper formulation and things are gonna change how this reacts, but at least with this paper, if you needed to use a paper like this on both sides, perfectly fine, no problem whatsoever. So that's going to be it for this paper. Our next paper is going to be the 50-pound Koh-i-Noor sketch paper. And now for the 50-pound Koh-i-Noor sketch paper. And that concludes the writing with the 50-pound Koh-i-Noor sketch paper. Now, this paper is not a very absorbent paper at all. I don't see any kind of feathering or spreading on this paper, which I did not expect. And I'm seeing even more shading on this paper, which I did expect. Because like I said, this is not a very absorbent paper whatsoever. In fact, this might be one of the least absorbent papers in my series of tests. Now on the smear test, it looks like I may have even got a little bit at the very first line, but really, mostly I think we're starting to smear about the fourth line, but there are some pigments closer to these other lines, so I think they smeared a little, but still it looks like about 7 seconds to dry on this paper. And you can see there's more of a smear here on the scrub than was with the other pages, but once again, it appears this is a fairly fast drying ink, even on this less absorbent paper. We're going to flip this over, and there is nothing to show on the back. I didn't think there would be. Even the somewhat more aggressive inks that have bled on some of the other pages have not bled on this. I don't think any of the inks I've tested so far have bled on this, and I've tested some of the Noodler's Polar inks, which are very aggressive, and even they didn't bleed on this paper. So, and that being said, this is a 50-pound paper, but it's very thin for a 50-pound paper. It just has to do with the formulation of paper, which makes up the properties and gets it to be that 50 pounds. So, passes with flying colors on this paper. And our next paper is going to be the Canson 98-pound mixed media paper. And so now here is the Canson 98-pound mixed media paper. concludes the writing with on the Canson mixed media paper. Now, once again, this paper here is not a very absorbent paper. This is meant to handle pretty much any kind of, like it says, mixed media, anything, acrylics, watercolors to an extent, alcohols, inks, you name it, and it has handled every single fountain pen ink that I have put on it with no problem whatsoever, even some of the more temperamental ones. There is definite shading here with this ink. I don't know if that's going to show. I think it even looks like it might be showing on the camera too. So that looks quite nice. You can see in the smear test, definitely looks like we started smearing around the 2-second mark, but still, even on this paper, that's actually quite quick, because most inks smear on all 10 seconds more significantly than this. So this appears to be quite a fast drying ink. You can also see the scrub smear there. So, you know, all things considered, once again, this not being absorbent paper at all, it's not just that it's soaking in, and this pen has a pretty wet flow to it, you know, for a fine. So yeah, this is a pretty fast drying ink, and it's working quite well on this paper. And there will be nothing on the back. None of my inks have ever bled through this that I've tested on it. Once again, this is a 98-pound paper. You can hear that. This is about the thickness of a piece of cardstock. So I didn't expect it to bleed through. Like I said, none of the inks so far that I've tested on this. I have not tested any media on this paper that has bled through the paper. So, but that pretty much concludes our actual writing test. Next, I'm going to show the chromatography, and after that, we're going to do the quick water resistance test. And here is my poor man's chromatography. I call this a poor man's chromatography because I don't actually have good proper filter paper. I did my chromatographies on paper towel, which does work, but it's not the best way to see, you know, get the best look at the colors and components, you know, potentially of an ink. But it does work. I put a line of ink down right there. I dipped this into a mixture of 70% isopropyl alcohol and water, mixed at a sort of 30 to 70-30 mix, mostly water. And as you can see, if I'm not going to get too much glare here from my lights, there is a very faint, sort of almost indigo looking line. I kind of changed the angle of this light so it's not washing out in the light here. But there's sort of this faint indigo kind of looking line here at the very bottom of the paper. Right there, that's where the initial link line was. And most of that traveled up the page, or up the paper, excuse me. And you can see that it kind of goes to this sort of teal, sky teal, bluish kind of color. Most of that darker blue came up the page, pretty high up the page, and then up at the top here, there is another line of a sort of tealish kind of color at the very top. So it's mostly, well, not necessarily completely uniform, but, you know, there is some kind of a chromatic change. So there appears to be at least a couple different, maybe even 3, because there's actually another dark purple up here. I don't know if that's going to show up right at the top between this sort of teal and that. There's a little bit of like a dark indigo or maybe a purple there. So there appears to be a few component parts of this ink of different colors that are kind of mixed to get the color of blue that you see in this ink. You know, like I said, this isn't the best chromatography. If I had better paper, you would potentially see more, but, you know, for what it's worth, there is my poor man's chromatography. And now on to the water test. And here we are on to our last test. This is going to be a water resistance test. This is just a little strip of 20-pound copy paper. I'm going to write the name of the ink on here. I'm going to draw little grid squares. I'm going to let the ink dry on the paper for about 30 seconds. Time of the watch. And then I'm going to take this pipette. I'm going to drip some water on here. Let the water stand on the paper for 10 seconds. Then I'm going to rub the water in and dab it off with a paper towel. And we'll see if any ink lifts off of the paper with the paper towel and how much runs on the paper. All right. All right. Well, you can clearly see we absolutely lifted some ink here. So that's clearly blue. Now, it did not fully pull everything off the paper, but it did pull quite a bit off the paper. So what I understand is I think they call this ink, they consider it, it's not waterproof. I think they sort of consider this water resistant. So my understanding was to get the color that Brian Goulet was after, they sort of sacrificed some of the permanence of the ink and resistance qualities of the ink to get the hue and color that was desired, because apparently there was a version of this ink that was mixed that was more resistant and permanent, and the color wasn't exactly what was sought after. So I pretty much expected to see this ink sort of move on the page, and you can see it did sort of bleed out around the ends and the dots. You can see that kind of bleeding. Like I said, obviously you can see the ink that lifted onto the paper towel. So it is not a ink, and it's not, like I said, it's not labeled as a bulletproof ink, as a permanent ink, and I knew that, but you know, I got that sample, so since I had the sample, I figured, you know, I'd go ahead and test it. So, you know, there it is. I don't know that it would necessarily completely wash it. It wouldn't, based on this, wash away if you accidentally dripped a few drops of water. Yes, it's going to move. You're going to see some of that ink move on places, and if you know, obviously, if you didn't rub it in like I did and just dab the water straight off, you'd probably see less disturbing of the ink, but I did rub it in a bit with my finger, so probably moved it more than you might otherwise see. But that being said, if you were writing with this and some water dripped on there, it might move, but it doesn't. It looks like you'll still have ink, so it's not going to completely wash it away. It would still be legible, but, you know, obviously not exactly waterproof. Now, as my final thoughts on this ink, it appears to be a pretty good daily writing ink. So if you just general use, you know, I think it would be good to use it in most applications. Like I said, on the copy paper, maybe not using both sides of the page. And that being said, this is a fine that flows fairly wet. Perhaps if I had used a extra fine, which I usually do, but this pen here was only available in a fine when I bought it, so that's kind of why I have a fine instead of an extra fine in this particular pen. But if you were using an extra fine, you might actually be able to get away with using this particular ink on copy paper, because it would be even drier writing, and you would probably have much less, or a decent chance that you wouldn't really get some of the bleeds and the ghosting that we saw on the copy paper. Now, I will like to add that, kind of like some of the other ink tests that I've done before, I do plan on taking the papers from this test, the Koh-i-Noor, the Blick, and the Canson papers, and taping them up in a window on the south side of my house, leaving them up for a month or 30 days to be exposed to sunlight, so that I can do a light fastness tests on the inks that were on the paper. So you saw the other inks so far. What I've got on that paper is Noodler's Heart of Darkness, Noodler's Wellman Sepia, and Noodler's Lexington Gray, and now this Noodler's Liberty's Elysium. I have a few other inks that I got to get through putting on that paper so I can begin that test. Being as how this is not labeled as a bulletproof or eternal ink, I fully expect to see this ink right here show some fading. Now I don't really know how much fading it will do. Like I said, I expect to at least see some. I was kind of surprised in my first run when I tested particularly the Bay State Concord grape, because it practically disappeared. After a month in the sunlight, you could barely even tell that ink was on there. Just barely a hint of pink in a few spots. Hopefully this one will fare better than that, but like I said, if it doesn't, this is not claimed to be a permanent eternal ink. So if it does degrade in the light test that will come later, I won't necessarily be surprised. But that's a video that you'll have to look forward to coming in the future. But for this video, that does it. Like I said, I think this will probably be a pretty good daily writing ink. I think it's a pretty color. It has some shading, which is fine. It's not a shimmer ink. It's not a sheening ink. But, for a good, an attractive looking, pretty bold blue, it's a nice looking ink. And like I said, based on the papers and what I've seen, it's pretty quick drying, and it appears to not be too terribly temperamental compared to some other inks that I've used. So with that all having been said, I hope those of you that watch this, if you watch it to the end, that you got some useful information out of this video, that it was good to help inform you. And if you watched it to this point and you enjoyed the video, you did get some information, useful information out of it, I would really appreciate if you could hit that like button down there. That would really help me out. And if you have any questions about this ink, questions about my videos, the tests that I do, or maybe you have some critiques or criticisms, suggestions, drop them down there in the comment section. I don't really get a lot of comments at this point in time. I don't have a lot of viewers. So if you drop a comment down there, I almost certainly will see it, and when I do, I will try to get back with you and leave you a comment. And if you've watched this video, maybe you've watched some of my other videos, you like the way I do my videos, like the way I present information, and maybe want to see more in the future, then, I'd also really appreciate a subscription. That would also help me out. But that does it for this video. I thank you for watching, and I hope to see you on the next one. Bye.